Okay, great. So let's do a screen share. Okay. Everybody see the text there?
Yep.
Okay. So I want to give you a little immunization in advance, lest you become disheartened by the fact that this seems to be dealing with last week's Torah portion. It's like eating, I don't know, cholent from Shabbos the coming week. That actually sounds pretty good to me, but so I know Arthur likes that one. So something occurred to me with regards to what we read in the Torah yesterday, which I think has great significance, way beyond just last week's Parsha. So I think it would be very worthwhile to examine this notion. Now, I want to start with a question which has always bothered me, and that is, how did the sages divide up the Torah into weekly Parshiot? In other words, what theory did they use to say, okay, this Parsha is going to begin with this chapter and verse, and is going to end with this chapter and verse? Right? Because the Torah is just one long text. It's not divided up organically in Parshiot. Neither is it organized organically in terms of chapter and verse, right? That's a Christian invention, as you probably are aware of.
Plus, we used to have a 3-year cycle, not just a 1-year cycle.
That's also true. That's also true. So I'm asking particularly upon the way we divide it up nowadays. Now, I'll tell you what strikes me is extremely strange. And that is, if you were awake for the Torah reading yesterday, Parshat Shemini, so really there's one big topic, and that is kashrut. That's the big topic in the Parsha. But at the beginning, they're sort of tagged on leftovers from last week's Parsha. Because last week's Parsha, which was Parshat Tzav, discussed the inauguration of the Mishkan and the inauguration of the Kohanim into their official duties. And then this week's Parsha, where it discusses the 8th day, Parshat Shemini, it's the 8th day of the process of inaugurating the Kohanim into their official function, which was discussed in last week's Parsha. So it would have been more organically logical to take the description of what happened on the 8th day of this 8-day process and put it together with the description of the other 7 days, which was in last week's Parsha. But instead, it sort of ripped off from that narrative describing the inauguration of the Kohanim, and it stuck on to a Parsha which mostly really talks about kashrut. So I just want to show you another example of this same phenomenon, which has always troubled me, and that is when you take a look at Parshat Pinchas. Parshat Pinchas begins with the aftermath of Pinchas in his great act of zealotry, shish kebabbing this Jewish male who's consorting with this woman in public, and he spears them through. And that's described in Parshat Balak. But in Parshat Pinchas, in the very beginning, we have the aftermath that God says, this guy's a really cool dude, and I'm Pinchas, and I'm going to give him a reward. And then the rest of the Parsha talks about Balak. I'm sorry. It talks about other things altogether different that are not connected at all to the episode of the zealotry of Pinchas. That really should have been connected to Parshat Balak. It should put in Parshat Balak, right, instead of Parshat Pinchas. What's going on there? So it's not just a peculiarity with this example of last week's Parsha and the week before that, why it's divided up that way. I could probably, if I sat down and went through all the Parshiot, I could probably think of a lot of other examples as well. Does everybody understand my problem? Okay, good. What I'd like to do is try to answer it. Let's take a look at the very end, more or less, of the episode of the inauguration of the Mishkan, inauguration of the Kohanim, which, of course, is extremely exciting. This divine fire comes down, and it in the Mishkan, not the thing that destroyed Nadav and Avihu. So people are all excited. You know, the divine presence has come into the Mishkan, and then it describes a terrible tragedy, which is the Nadav and Avihu did something wrong, not clear what, and God kills them. So that's the end of the episode, which really should have been in the previous Parsha. So let's take a look at how the Torah concludes that whole affair. By Deber Hashem el Aharon lemor.
Are all the other Parshiot logically broken up? I mean,
so that's what I was saying. That
every Parsha in the whole.
Yeah, so that's what I was saying. That I haven't done the work, but I have a feeling that just like I gave the example of Balak and Pinchas, that it's also not logical. I think I could go, if I went carefully through all the Parshiot, I could find a lot of examples. But I would say, generally speaking, there's some kind of coherence, but there are a bunch of exceptions, and that's what bothers me, right? Why? What was the logic in creating these Parshiot in the way that they appear, where it doesn't seem to be coherent, right? It should be the beginning of the Parsha really should have been the end of last week's Parsha, etc. Okay, so what does the Torah say with the conclusion of this particular episode of the deaths of the sons of Nadav and Avihu, sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu? So Hashem said to Aaron, wine and intoxicating beverage you shall not drink. Ata uvanecha itach, you and your children with you, your sons. Ata itach bevorachem el omoed, in your coming to the tent of meeting. V'lo tamutu, and you shall not die. Chukat lam l'dorotechem, and this is an eternal statute for all your generations. Ulahavdil bein hakodesh uvein hachol, uvein hatamei uvein hatahor, to make a havdalah, a distinction between the holiness and the profane, between the impure and the pure, and to instruct Bnei Yisrael all of the various laws which God has commanded through Moshe. Fine. That's the very end of that episode of the inauguration of the Mishkan, the inauguration of the Kohanim to their tasks, the tragic deaths of the sons of Aaron, Nadav, and Avihu, and then we find that pasuk. Now, interestingly enough, let's take a look at the very end of the parsha, which is the end of this long discussion of kashrut, the animals you're allowed to eat and animals you're not allowed to eat. And look at how the Torah ends that whole discussion. Zot Torah behema ve'of. This is the instruction concerning the animals and the fowl, v'chol nefesh chaya romeset b'mayim, the fish, v'chol nefesh sheretzet al haaretz, l'havdil ben hatamei u'ben hatahor, to make havdalah between the impure and the pure, u'ben hachaya ne'achelet, u'ben hachaya asher lo te'achel, and between animal which is eaten and animal which is not eaten. Now, very subtle here. Do you notice that we have remarkably this almost the same exact phrase in the beginning of the Parsha, which is dealing with something else, dealing with the Mishkan and the aftermath of the deaths of the sons of Aaron. Ulahavdil ben hakodesh u'ben hachol u'ben hatamei u'ben hator, to make havdalah, this distinction between holy and profane, impure and pure, and here lahavdil ben hatamei v'hator, to make a distinction between havdalah, between the impure and the pure. Well, that's fascinating. So now we're seeing literary bookends which unite the beginning of the parsha with the end of the parsha, which is lahavdil, to make havdalah bein tamei uvein tahor, between the impure and the pure. So even though we started out by saying there doesn't seem to be any connection between the beginning of the parsha, which is really leftovers from the previous parsha dealing with the Kohanim, and the bulk of the parsha, which deals with kosher animals. But now we're noticing that, in fact, when the sages divided up the material the way he divided up, there is a literary connection. There's a kind of literary symmetry, and that is lahavdil, to make this distinction, havdalah. Now, what I want to try to do is, perhaps that's the clue. Perhaps that's the clue which will help us understand why the sages did something very awkward of taking an episode which really is leftovers from the previous parsha and sticking it on to the next parsha. What I'd like to do is understand a little bit better, what does that phrase mean, lahavdil bein tamei uvein tahor, to make this havdalah, this distinction between the impure and the pure. Let's take a look at the Rambam, how the Rambam understands this. Mitzvata seleda hasimanim, shemavdilim behen bein behema v'chayav v'of v'dagim v'chagavim shemutar lochlan. It's a positive mitzvah. The Rambam counts what we're about to read as one of the 613 mitzvot. It's a positive mitzvah to know the distinguishing signs, shemavdilin havdalah, right, that make a distinction between the things that you're allowed to eat and the things you're not allowed to eat. Shene'emar, v'hivdaltem bein habeima Torah l'tmeya. That it says in the Torah, a little bit later in Vayikra, you shall make a distinction between the pure animal and the impure animal, and a impure fowl and a pure fowl. And now he quotes the parsha we just read, V'ne'emar lahavdil, making havdalah, bein tamei uvein tahor uvein chaya hanechelet uvein chaya asher lo te'echel, to make a distinction between the impure animal and the pure animal, etc. Now, the way the Rambam formulates it, it sounds like it may be just you should know the animals you're allowed to eat and the animals you're not allowed to eat. Right? That's the mitzvah, to make that that distinction in terms of your awareness. Right? This you're allowed to eat, this you're not allowed to eat. But look how the Sefer Chinuch understands this Rambam. He says the following. He paraphrases essentially the language of the Rambam, and then he says, "Ve'over aleha v'lo badak." If a person transgressed this positive mitzvah of lahavdil by not checking, el sharaba hasiman echad, he only saw one sign that marked this animal as kosher. You need two. He only checked and he just saw one. V'samach alav v'echal mimena. And he relied upon the fact that it had one of the signs of a kosher animal, and he went ahead and ate it. Even though afterwards he found that, yeah, it was kosher. Well, look at this. I see both signs there. He has nullified this positive mitzvah to check the signs. So the Sefer Chinuch takes the Rambam, which is based upon our Parsha, right, where it says lahavdil, you're supposed to make this distinction. The Rambam seems to be talking about like in a cognitive sense, like I understand this is tamei, this is tahor, so I can eat this. But Sefer Chinuch translated as actually an active mitzvah. You're required to actively do the checking. It's not just a cognition, but it's an action to check. And if you don't check, even though it was kosher, you nullified one of the positive 248 positive mitzvot in the Torah. That's how the Sefer Chinuch understands the Rambam. So this notion of havdalah with regards to kashrut is not, which is the bookends at the end of the parsha, is not just a notion of understanding, but it's a very hands-on detailed checking, taking inventory to make sure that this is a kosher animal based upon the two simanim, the two signs. Now, I'd like to get philosophical for a second. That's a kind of a warning. First, I'm going to drink some coffee. I already made a bracha, so don't suspect me of anything. It's actually whiskey. That really helps. Okay, I'd like to take a look at a theme in the teachings of Rav Kook, which is foundational. The more I learn Rav Kook, and I've learned whatever, I put a lot of attention to learning Rav Kook, the more it emerges of certain foundational themes which permeate his thinking and come up over and over and over again. So let's take a look at this particular passage. This is in Orot HaKodesh. Orot HaKodesh is the work which was made by his student, the Nazir, who wanted to systematize Rav Kook's thinking. Rav Kook was not a systematic thinker. He didn't write a guide for the perplexed like the Rambam to systematize his philosophy. He jotted down all these thoughts, and the Nazir wanted to create a kind of systematic presentation, and that's Orot HaKodesh. So the Nazir took paragraphs from Rav Kook's other works, his notebooks, and organized them topically to create sort of this systematic presentation. He says the following: ideologies tend to be in conflict. One group at times reacts to another with total negation, right? So the Knesset, you have these different parties reflecting different ideologies, and to the extent that people believe firmly in their particular worldview, they negate, it seems, totally the view of the other side. And this opposition becomes more pronounced the more important a place the ideas have in the human spirit. So, right, if you're talking about whether you like the Giants or the Mets, so I don't know if people would get violent about that, but to the extent that a person perceives their thinking about important ideas, to that extent, the opposition to another idea becomes very strong. To one who assesses all this opposition on the basis of its inner significance, it appears as illustrating the need of the spatial separation of plants. We'll discuss this in a second. I'll give you hints talking about medical marijuana cultivation. The spatial separation, that's a joke, spatial separation of plants, which serves as an aid to their growth, enabling them to suck up from the earth their needed sustenance. So Rav Kook says, if you take a look at these disputes within the Jewish world, though I don't think you limit it just to the Jewish world, but that's his immediate concern. These disputes, if you could see, even though they seem to be disputes in which one side totally negates the value of the other side, but if you look at the inner aspect, you'll see that it can be compared to an analogy. The analogy is that if you're growing plants, you need to have separation spatially of the plants so that each one can receive the nourishment that is required from the earth. If they're too close to each other, then they're going to deprive each other of their proper sustenance, and they won't grow fully. Thus will each one develop to its fullness, and the distinctive characteristics of each plant, right, that's what he's talking about here, will take shape in all its details. Something that would have been blurred and impaired if they were too close. If you plant these plants too close to each other, then in fact, none of them are going to grow properly.
Rabbi,
Yes.
is this a scientific reality statement or a halachic reality statement?
So, I know nothing about gardening or agriculture. So, whatever, because at the end of the day, it's only a mashal, it's only an analogy. And so I can understand the analogy, even though we'll have to ask one of our resident green thumb gardeners here if there's any reality to it. So the truth of the analog is not dependent upon the particular analogy. The proper unity can only result from such distance. One begins with separation and ends with unity. Okay, now here, so Rav Kook is saying something fascinating, that the distance between the plants, say you're, especially some kind of like a cultivated garden, especially if it's for aesthetic, perhaps aesthetic purposes, you want to create a kind of a total effect of this, of all these different plants. And when you go into this garden, you have this experience as a result of the aesthetic presented by the garden in its totality. So you have to have a cultivation of the individuality of each of these different species of plants. So he says one begins with separation, ends with unity. That the unity, the coherent aesthetic effect in this particular case, is only accomplished successfully if there is cultivation of separation. Now, this happens to be a Zohar. One begins with separation, ends with unity. It's not talking about gardens. It's talking about some mystical notion, which Rav Kook is using as a fundamental way of understanding disputes within society. I want to take a look at another passage from Rav Kook, also from Ortho Kodesh, where he deals with this same issue. And by the time, hopefully, we see these two different sources, we'll be able to step back and try to explain what he's suggesting. He says the following: "This is the inheritance of the Lord in all manner of Kodesh. Differentiation for the sake of connection. There has to be differentiation in order to create unity, which seems to be counterintuitive, right? Differentiation means the opposite of unity. And you see here that he's again alluding to the Zohar, which he's going to quote explicitly in a moment. This is the opposite of crude inclusiveness that speaks arrogantly and proclaims the intention of unifying all into one, but destroys all spiritual grandeur and nobility." There's tremendous implications of this, even obviously political implications of this, that people talk in these kind of highfalutin terms about universalism and inclusiveness, right? So Rav Kook says that if it's a kind of primitive, crude inclusiveness, actually it undermines unity. It gives lip service to unity, but it undermines unity. It destroys all spiritual grandeur and nobility. Ultimately, through the darkening of life, there is sullied the light of clear intellect. Crude love of the uniqueness of each creature becomes powerful and contaminated until all become separate, and the land wobbles like a drunkard from the weight of sin. This is Rav Kook's language. It's not always clear exactly what he's talking about, but he's developing this notion that when there's this kind of crude inclusiveness, we're all one, we're all brothers, right? We have to be a big tent, include everybody, that in fact, it doesn't lead to coherent unity. On the contrary, it actually leads to divisiveness. Now he quotes these explicitly Kabbalistic ideas. The Sitra Achra, I'll explain that in a second, begins with connection and ends in differentiation, while the Sitra of Kedusha begins in differentiation and ends in connection. Let's talk about that. These are very common Kabbalistic terms, Sitra de Kedusha and Sitra Achra. Sitra de Kedusha means something which is associated with holiness. Now, to go into a more specific analysis of what that means Kabbalistically is not for today, but things that are associated with holiness begin with clear differentiation, but then the result from that clear differentiation of difference is coherent unity. A coherent unity. But something which is associated with Sitra Achra. Sitra Achra just means in Aramaic the other side, meaning the opposite of holiness. Unholiness. impurity. Begins with connection. Yes, we're all brothers. The big tent. We must be tolerant and accepting of all because we're all one big family. So there's this lip service to inclusiveness, connection, but the end is a complete fragmentation, ends in differentiation. And then Rav Kook ends this by saying that when you approach things properly, where there's clear delineation of difference leading to coherence of the bigger picture of connection, that's called shalom. Shalom is not some notion of we're all the same, but rather it's the careful detailing of distinction leading to a greater coherence and aesthetic, which this coherent picture is composed of component parts which are carefully delineated and defined. And ironically, that leads to greater coherence, and that's shalom. Shalom doesn't mean we're all the same. Shalom means coherence. Coherence of all the component parts. Achieved dafka through the definition, delineation, clarification of difference. You begin with that. And then you're led to this coherence of shalom. Now, this may seem to be incredibly abstract, and maybe it is. But I'd like to see if we can develop it. What's Rav Kook saying here? Living the life of Jewish tradition is a commitment to distinction. That's what we do all day long. This I'm allowed to do. This I'm not allowed to do. This is kosher. This is not kosher. This is pure. This is impure. That can sound like fragmentation. This notion of focusing on carefully delineated differences, like the Sefer Chinuch interpreted the Rambam, who interpreted the laws of kashrut. Lahavdil, Havdalah. What's Havdalah? Havdalah is making distinctions. And making distinctions in the most exacting and active sense, like Sefer Chinuch. You have to actually check for the two simanim. And it's one of the 248 mitzvot of the Torah, according to the Rambam. So that process, which seems to be fragmenting reality, paradoxically, leads to coherence. Let's develop this a little bit more. And just to maybe articulate it, the opposite, which is not to see all these component parts, not to do Havdalah, not to make Havdalah, not to make all these distinctions, definitions, and delineations, leads to fragmentation, even violent fragmentation. Take a look at a Gemara in Masechet Yomah, and in the aftermath of Purim, this may look familiar. Kol notein eino b'koso. Anybody who literally puts his eye in his cup. I'm sorry?
That's the question. So you're basically saying,
Yeah.
unless there are clear boundaries, unless you have a clear distinction between Tahor, Tameh, and Tahor, you're going to have fragmentation if you don't delineate between them?
Yeah, but a negative fragment, a destructive fragmentation.
Yeah, if you don't separate them, you're going to have fragmentation.
Yeah. So it's a huge idea, which by the time we are finished today, I hope it'll be more clear. Right now it might sound a little abstract. Look what the Gemara says here. Someone who puts his literally eye in his cup is referring to someone who has a excessive fondness for alcohol. Right? what's his experience like? This person drinks, he has bourbon for breakfast, wine for lunch, and scotch for dinner, right? So that person, kol ha'olam kulo domeh alav k'mishur. The whole world looks like a mishur. Mishur means like level. So, meaning, what doesn't he see? A person who's drunk doesn't see differentiation. The whole world is just one big, beautiful, happy unity. That's because he's drunk. To be sober means to be able to see distinction. Let's take a look at another Gemara here.
That might be a plug for getting drunk if that's the idea.
By the way, this could be interesting because next week's Parsha is Tazria. So you'll see that we're going to be able to connect Tzav, Shemini, and Tazria. So you can regard this as preparation for next week's Parsha. Okay? Look at the Gemara says here. You might find this a little offensive. I know there's some very ardent feminists out there, like Bruce, that, but just, whatever. Just control yourself here. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Kol mavdil alayayin b'motzei Shabbatot havian lo banim zcharim. A person who makes havdalah. Remember the term which unified this parsha, which really we asked in the beginning shouldn't be unified, right? It's dealing with leftovers from last week's parsha, which is this notion of the sons of Nadav and Avihu, and then slaps it on to the laws of kashrut, which is the bulk of the parsha, and we notice that it had the word lahavdil, concluding the story of Nadav and Avihu, their deaths, and lahavdil, being the tamei v'tahor, make distinction between the pure and the impure, at the conclusion of the laws of kashrut, these kind of literary bookends of making havdalah. So somebody makes havdalah, they're going to get a big reward for it. What is that? Banim zacharim, male kids. Now, I know, Bruce, control yourself. I know you're extremely offended that there should be some kind of preference associated with male children. So I don't want to think about that for now. But somehow that's a tremendous bracha to have male children. By the way, as someone with 9 children, 5 daughters and 4 sons, my personal opinion is that girls are a lot easier to raise than boys. Don't make any comments about that. But so I'm not sure exactly why boys are such a big bracha. But in any case, so you make havdalah, you get a bracha. Dichti. Now, how do I learn that? Lahavdil ben hakodesh u'ben hachol. Because last week's parsha ended with making havdalah. Lahavdil ben hakodesh u'ben hachol. And then what's the very next item from the following parsha, this coming Shabbat? Uchtiv hatam lahavdil ben hatamei u'ben hatahor v'samich le isha ki tazria v'yalda zachar. Right? So it ends with making havdalah, parsha Shemini, and the next week, this coming Shabbat, is isha ki tazria v'yalda zachar. A woman becomes pregnant and she gives birth to a male. So making havdalah leads to bracha, the special bracha of having male children. A special, it's fruitful, we could say, it's productive. But making havdalah is a productive, constructive act, which leads to this bracha of, in this case, male children. Something about havdalah being good. Now, Rav Kook just explained. What is havdalah? Havdalah is making distinctions. When you start with making distinctions, very carefully delineated, it leads to very good things: coherence, wholeness, productivity. If you start with false inclusiveness, we're all the same, we're all one big happy family, that leads to destructiveness, cacophony, disaster, disintegration. Let's go on. Something that's always troubled me, troubled everybody, as a matter of fact. See, we just discussed what Havdalah at the end of the Parsha with Kashrut, what it means according to the Rambam, Sefer Chinuch, and seeing how Rav Kook associates Havdalah as an absolutely necessary first step, which ultimately leads to coherence. Let's go back now to the beginning of last week's Parsha with the tragic deaths of the sons of Aaron. At first glance, they got punished, right? But it's puzzling why the Torah then says, Vayomer Moshe Aaron, Kadesh. Moshe said to Aaron, oh, now, this is what the Lord has spoken about when he said, I will become sanctified through those who are close to me. And in front of the entire nation, I shall be honored by Yidom Aaron, and Aaron was silent. That sounds a little positive there. Bikrovai Kadesh, that God says I'll be sanctified by those people who are close to me. Something that's positive about Nadav and Avihu. They must have done something wrong because God killed them. But they're called Krovim, close to a Kodesh Baruch Hu. Let's go on, try to see if we can put this now together. What did they do, as a matter of fact? Nobody knows. Nobody knows what they did to receive that response from Hashem. Let's take a look at a typical collection of what they may have done. Rabbi Imani, Yishav, Rabbi Yoshua, Desichnin, Rabbi Yochanan, B'Shem, Rabbi Levi, Amru, Bishvil, Arba'a Dvarim, Meitu, B'nei Aaron. These different rabbis said 4 reasons. They did 4 bad things. It's interesting. I chose this particular midrash. There's tons of collections of all the different things they may have done wrong. A lot of the sources make it into a dispute. One opinion says they did this. Another opinion says they did that. I like this because it's suggesting they did not this or that, but they did them all. Well, what did they do? So let's take a look at the 4 things. They had drank wine. Now, this shouldn't be surprising because right after the episode is described of them being killed, we'll just go back to our first source here that we quoted. The Torah says, right? This is a famous idea. God says to Aaron, Yad v'sheicha al tesht, ata u'benecha, right? Don't drink wine, which sort of implies that must have been the problem. They were drunk. So let's go back down to the midrash here. Right? So that's one thing. They were drunk. Now, what else did they do? Bear in mind, by the way, as we go through this, what the Gemara said about a person who's drunk. Everything's mishor. Everything's the same. A person who puts his eye into their drink, the whole world is just beautiful. We're all one big, happy, the sameness. Okay? Another thing they did wrong is they were missing garments. Okay? They weren't wearing the right clothes to carry out their tasks. We're going to skip all the proof text, not important for our discussion today. Another thing they did wrong, they entered the sanctuary without washing their hands and feet. And that's a serious thing, right? And that's a third thing they did. 4th thing, due to the lack of children, they didn't have any kids. They're not supposed to do the service that they carried out if they didn't have kids. So, according to this midrash, they did a whole bunch of things. The first thing is they were drunk. And all the other things are these details dealing with the laws of Kohanim in that particular context. I don't want to get into a halachic discussion here about these particular detailed things. Bruce, were you going to ask a detailed halachic question about...
No. I'm just curious why, since the Torah does tell us black and white that they brought strange fire they weren't commanded to bring, what then is the impetus to come up with other things?
Yeah, so it's a good question. One thing is the fact that the Torah says "Be Krovai Kadesh," right? That the Torah says that there's something positive about them, seemingly. those close to me. And furthermore, the fact that Torah says that God spoke to Aaron and said, don't drink. So now I'm confused.
After the fact.
Right. It's like, wait a second. Like they brought
Now
in
you tell me.
this foreign fire. But wait a second. But then it says don't drink. And it says also they're close to God. So that's why there's a lot of confusion about. It's actually one of the most interesting episodes in the Torah where it's just so ambiguous and confusing, and there's just such an incredible range of opinion. Now, could it be that when it says don't drink, remember what the Gemara said, once you drink, everything is a mishur, meaning what isn't there? There's no havdalah. See, mishur is the opposite. Mishur is everything's the same, unity. Havdalah is distinction. Once they drank, then distinction falls away. Let's take a look now. We're not going to put this all together, hopefully. Rav Kook actually deals explicitly with this case. When one follows an elevated idea, which is drawn from the divine spirit, or any form of lofty wisdom or expression, without being personally connected to the Torah and its ways, or the qualities and virtues it teaches, then such is the sin of Nadav and Avihu, the separation of the paternal principle from the Supreme Mother. Now, that sentence is actually almost coherent, except for the end there, the separation of the paternal principle from the Supreme Mother, and we'll try to explain that in just a second. What's Rav Kook saying so far? That when one is inspired by some inspiring idea drawn from the divine spirit, I'm a spiritual person, I'm very spiritual, but not rooted in the details of the Torah, not rooted in Havdalah. What is Havdalah? Differentiation, classification, dissection. If one is attracted to spirituality, not preceded and anchored in the halachic details, that's the sin of Nadav and Avihu. Now, he makes this reference to the separation of the paternal principle from the Supreme Mother. Let me tell you what I think that means, and I may be mistaken. The paternal principle and the Supreme Mother, that's a reference to the two highest sfirot, Chokhmah and Bina. Briefly, Chokhmah is undifferentiated, immediate access to God without definition. Bina is classification, definition, compartmentalization. If you've ever learned Tanya, the Baal Tanya explains this in a lot of detail. Chokhmah is associated with the first letter in God's name, Yud He Vav He. Yud. Yud is the smallest letter, undefined, little dot. Hey, all of a sudden, the shape of the letter. It's dimensional. So Yud, Chokhmah, is the undefined, raw, exhilarating experience of divine immediacy, spirituality. Hey, Bina, is taking that undifferentiated oneness and spiritual high, bring it down to earth, classifying, defining, etc. But if you separate those two, you are involved and desirous of being intimate with God, but without halacha, no details. That's bina. That is fatal, a fatal blow. Spirituality not grounded in the particulars of the halachic system. Separation of chokhmah from bina. Those who act in that manner think that they are drawing near to the holy, even offering a strange fire and entering the holy drunk with wine. Everything's the same. Ecstatic spirituality. Without the fear of heaven that stems from a supreme source and comes to a covered head, but rather with an uncovered head. There's actually midrashim that talk about that they didn't have their head covered. Just on the long list of things they didn't do. But this is understood as symbolically without Yirat Shamayim, without the rooting of spirituality in the details of halacha. No havdalah. No havdalah. And each one unites with his unique comprehension without the supernal binding of the inheritance of Moshe's Torah. My spirituality is mine. It's my authentic relationship with God. To me, Shabbat is gardening. I'm making this up. But I once heard someone say this. He said, Rabbi, like this Shabbat business, like to me, a day off and pleasure is gardening. But that's what 39 blachot, I can't do it. If spirituality, not anchored in the details of halakha, reigns, then each one is dug into their own authenticity, and it's chaotic, no coherence, fractured. And each one unites with this unique comprehension without the spiritual binding of the inheritance of Moshe's Torah. And they do not consult with each other, and they issue halachic ruling to the presence of their master, right? That's another one of the sins they did, right? They paskin shailas without asking Moshe. That's another way of saying, I'm going to do what's authentic to me. The great depth of this holiness must efface itself before the source of the Torah. Let's go on now.
Rabbi, does this limit spirituality, therefore, to just the Jewish people?
Very important point here.
Spirituality.
Okay, so hang on a second. I think he's going to answer your question. So, because he then says, we're going to skip to the end here. The stormy spirit of youth, which stirs up with strength and might. See, a young person is full of enthusiasm. I want that electrical charge of direct experience of divinity, but not too interested in being cautious and careful how I behave. No havdalah. So that stormy spirit of youth, which stirs up with strength and might, together with the orderly spirit of old age, become more cautious as we get older. Is that true? I haven't got that stage yet in life. But Arthur, is that true? We become more cautious as we get older?
Not yet.
Yeah. Okay. That's because you're still in the stage of youth. Okay. I'll have to ask somebody who's old. So those two will join together to impact upon life, spiritual material, to hasten salvation and become the basis for the offspring of God. So what he's saying here is you do need both. We need to have the spiritual, ecstatic experience, the desire to be close to God, be krovai kadesh. God says, among those who are close to me, I will be sanctified. Nadav and Avihu were excited, spiritually ecstatic. The problem with that is when you begin with unity, you're eyeing your cup. You end with chaos. If you begin your journey anchored in havdalah, distinction, differentiation, then you can go to the next level of seeing the coherence of all the component parts. And the Messianic world will be a world, which is referred to here, in which the ecstatic desire to experience God in some kind of direct way will be anchored and unified with havdalah. The solemnity and caution of the halachic system, the sobriety, perhaps we could even say, of the halachic system. Let's now turn back and see if we can answer our original question. We started out by noticing that there's something terribly incoherent about the Parsha. It has leftovers from the Parsha before it, dealing with the deaths of the sons of Nadav and Avihu. tacked on to the laws of kashrut. We notice there's a literary unification. Lahavdil, ben kodesh ben kol, ben tamei ben toher. With regards to the issue of the Daven Avihu, to make distinctions, Havdalah, and then also the end of the discussion of kashrut, which is the bulk of the parsha, exactly the same phrase, Lahavdil ben tamei ben toher. Through the lenses of Rav Kook, you're understanding that Havdalah means anchoring in differentiation, careful and cautious interaction with the world, in which we make distinctions between good and evil, between holy and profane, between impure and pure. And only through that does one then create the coherent picture. We now can understand what was wrong with Nadav and Avihu. What happened with Nadav and Avihu was spiritual exhilaration, not anchored in Havdalah. And it seems, based upon this, that we now understand how the Torah, or I should say the sages, saw these two themes of Nadav and Avihu, their deaths, connected with the laws of kashrut, because they wanted to make this point that the mitzvah of Havdalah is the prerequisite to Kedusha, the holiness. And just like with Nadav and Avihu, that is precisely the theme there. That Kedusha, holiness, the experience of the ineffable author of all being, must be anchored in Havdalah, distinction, the care and sober analysis of difference, permissible, non-permissible, etc. So that now becomes the meta theme that unites this whole parsha, the necessity for Havdalah as a means to Kedusha. And that might explain why the sages took that aspect of the lack of Havdalah, the inebriated yearning for holiness, not anchored in detail, and the disaster that leads to, with the laws of kashrut, which is exactly that same notion of Havdalah. Havdalah is the foundational theme of kashrut, which is, it is being remiss, the reason for the tragic death of the sons of Nadav and Avihu. And in this way, we see a beautiful, coherent structure of this parsha from the beginning to the end, and would explain why the sages who made these parsha divisions chose to take that conclusion dealing with Nadav and Avihu and attach it to the laws of kashrut. I hope that was fairly clear. We could take a minute or two for questions. Any questions or comments?
The main dot, Havdalah Minayin.
Yeah.
The main Havdalah dot.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I saw a lot of people quote that idea. It's beautiful. Arthur.
Yeah, the original question gets me thinking, why is it five books? Why do we call it Chamisha Chumzei Torah? It's one Torah. Where'd that come from?
Yeah.
It just when you start talking about divisions.
Yeah, so, one could say, I don't know, but one could say that it is interesting that we, if you say to somebody, if you think about this for a second, if you're in shul and you want to ask somebody you're about to read the Torah on Shabbat, can you pass me what book are you going to ask for? What do you call it? A chumash.
Chumash.
Pass me a chumash. You don't say pass me a Torah, right? A chumash. Now, so that's fascinating that we refer to the Torah by the term, Arthur, as you've just pointed out, conveys a notion of differentiation. And this makes perfect sense spiritually. Now, I don't know if this is the historical explanation. It's probably not. But on some kind of non-pshat level, it's kind of the mystical, spiritual explanation of why it is that we refer to the Torah with this word chumash, because that's the beginning, as the Zohar says, right? That The Sitra, the Kedusha, is we begin with differentiation, and then we come to coherence. But Sitra Achra is we begin with the false claim of unity, which then devolves into chaos. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Bruce.
I'm thinking if you're an artist on any level and you have a box of crayons, you know those big old boxes with all those crayons? If
Yep.
each crayon has the paper on it and the color clearly demarcated, so you know what color it is. So you can more clearly request what color or look at them and make the kind of picture you want at the end of the day, as opposed to if they were all like melted together and in a great blob of crayon unity, you couldn't then make the picture you'd want. But in that example, it's really clear why there's a difference and what the goal is. We don't really know the differences or why there's a difference in the plants and the animals and all the differentiations that we make, really. It's just, we're just told to do it. We don't really understand the why, like we would with a box of Crayola crayons.
Yeah. Okay, so it's an
But
interesting point you're making.
I thought Rav Kook encouraged different thinking and encouraged different opinions, and togetherness makes the whole. The various
so
distinct opinions.
Beautiful, beautiful. That's exactly two comments. So yes, 100% right. That's why I said this is like a foundational theme in the thinking of Rav Kook. That's why Rav Kook was able to somehow see all of these different opinions that somehow everybody's fighting each other to somehow see this as some kind of, in fact, there is unity that people aren't appreciating, which will emerge from these kind of distinctions. But put that aside for a second, but I just want to deal with Bruce's issue for a second, and that is that, Bruce, at first I thought you were saying, why did Rav Kook give this analogy of the plants? Wouldn't it be better to talk about crayons? so as I thought you were going to do. But then you said that with crayons, the making distinction between the different colors and making that clear and defining it is understandable why you'd want to do that, because you're trying to create a picture. So you need to know if this is black, purple, blue, whatever, right? But we're just told to obey, this is permitted, this is forbidden, etc. Like, that's not like crayons. So I say the following. It's really interesting, your point. So one thing I would say is, to the extent that we're able to understand the reasons for these distinctions, so that's good, it's praiseworthy. But I actually think that Rav Kook is saying something deeper, and that is, and I know this is not really answering your question. I'm just, I had a Rebbe for 4 years in New York, Rav Parnas. Rav Parnas used to say sometimes people would ask a question, and he would say, the answer is take the question mark off and just put a period. Make a statement, an observation rather than a question. So I think what I'm going to do that with you, Bruce, and we're just going to say, you may not be satisfied with this, that that the exercise of making distinction per se has a salutary impact. The caution of old age, as Rav Kook used that expression here, of where we make these distinctions based upon the wisdom of the Creator, right? God has said, I want you to make these distinctions. We might not understand why. We may go to a nutritional counselor who will say, eat this, don't eat that. Eat this, don't eat that. These vegetables, but not these vegetables, etc. It may not really, it'd be nice to understand why, but it's not necessary to have the beneficial effect of making distinctions. And so therefore, going through life, making careful distinctions, even though we may not understand exactly why, is still that approach of bina, right, of classification, havdalah, which then has this positive effect, even though it'd be nice to know why, but I'm not sure it's necessary to reap the benefits of these distinctions that we know why. Okay, with that, I leave you. And for those of you worried that I left extraterrestrial in the dustbin, I haven't. I'm completely committed to it. I'm knee deep in ET. So, but it turns out, like many things, just like this, we asked a very specific question. It developed into a major theme. it turns out that how you understand the notion of extraterrestrial life raises really fundamental questions. I'll just give you a hint. For instance, what are angels? Now, you might think that, well, what's that have to do with extraterrestrials? The whole thing started because Bruce wanted to say that these B'nai Elohim, these angels, according to some opinions, came down to earth, mated with human beings. Maybe those those B'nai Elohim were actually extraterrestrials. So even though these other sources refer to them as angels, so that's one issue. But even a bigger issue is it conceivable that Judaism doesn't think that a human being is the end all and be all and reason for existence of the cosmos? Maybe we're just a sideshow. Is that possible? Arthur, I like that. So you'll see. So these are. It's going to raise really fundamental issues. I'm having a lot of fun looking into it, and there's lots of Hashem. We'll have it ready for next week. Take care, everybody.
And just again on other forms of spirituality out there that have all kinds of distinctions as well, are they therefore in a legitimate spiritual environment, or do we say no? It's not Torah and Mitzvot, so it's just a bunch of gobbledygook. It's mixed crayons. I mean,
that's interesting. So I would say, at first glance, I would say the distinction has to be rooted in something which is true, right? So the Torah is true. But on second thought, and I don't know if Rav Kook would even agree with this, that there's something about leading a disciplined life that need based upon certain cultural mores, which are not rooted in Torah. But there's something about that, to use the analogy that Rav Kook used, old age, that caution of old age, that a person lives in a way which is in harmony and fidelity to a very fleshed out, organized system of ethics, which may be culturally influenced and not so based upon the Torah, that may actually have a positive effect, according to Rav Kook, independent of being rooted in absolute truth. But I'm not really sure. That's an interesting question. And I think I won't be able to sleep for the next week because of that question. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Rav Zah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
May the force stay with you.